The parent-teacher conference folder trembled slightly in my hands as I read the name at the top. Sophia Mitchell, grade 3. Below it, in the emergency contact section, was a phone number I had once known by heart and a signature that still made my chest tighten even after 3 years. David Mitchell, father. I set the folder down on my desk with the kind of careful precision that comes from years of practiced emotional control. The afternoon sunlight streaming through my classroom windows caught the dust motes dancing in the air, and for a moment, I let myself absorb the irony. The man who had once told me I'd never amount to anything was about to sit across from me in 20 minutes, listening as I discussed his daughter's exceptional progress in my third-grade classroom. The same daughter who had, just that morning, wrapped her small arms around my waist and whispered, "Mrs. Chen, you're the best teacher in the whole world." 3 years ago, I had been Sarah Mitchell. 3 years ago, I had been David's wife, living in his shadow, molding myself smaller and smaller until I could barely remember who I'd been before him. 3 years ago, I had been a woman who apologized for existing, who believed that my dreams were too big, my voice too loud, my aspirations too ambitious for someone like me. "You'll never amount to anything, Sarah." Those had been his exact words, delivered with the casual cruelty that had become his signature over our 5-year marriage. "You think you're so smart with your little education degree, but look where it's gotten you. 28 years old and still playing with finger paints and picture books?" I remember that moment with crystalline clarity. We'd been standing in our kitchen. His kitchen, really, since he never let me forget who paid the mortgage, and I just told him about the teaching position I'd been offered at Riverside Elementary. It wasn't much, just a long-term substitute role, but it was a foot in the door, a chance to finally use the degree I'd earned while working nights to support us through his graduate program. And David had been loading the dishwasher, and he didn't even turn around when he spoke. That mechanical indifference was somehow worse than if he'd screamed at me. "I've been thinking," he'd continued, his voice carrying that particular tone he used when he'd already made a decision for both of us. "Maybe it's time you focused on what you're actually good at. Make yourself useful around here. My mother called today, and she mentioned that Rebecca's pregnant again. Maybe we should think about starting a family." The words had hit me like a physical blow. Not because I didn't want children someday, but because of what he wasn't saying. Because behind his suggestion lay the unspoken truth that he didn't believe I was capable of anything beyond serving his needs, beyond being an extension of his life rather than the architect of my own. "I already accepted the position," I'd said quietly. That's when he'd turned around and I'd seen that particular expression cross his face, the one that said I'd overstepped, that I'd forgotten my place in the carefully constructed hierarchy of our relationship. "Well, you'll just have to unaccept it." His tone was final, dismissive. "Sarah, be realistic. You barely made it through student teaching without falling apart. Remember how you used to call me crying because you couldn't handle a classroom full of kids? You're not cut out for this. You're being naive if you think you can just waltz into a career because you feel like it." The worst part was that a piece of me believed him. After years of his subtle erosion of my confidence, after countless moments where he'd positioned himself as the voice of reason while painting my dreams as childish fantasies, I'd internalized his voice until it became indistinguishable from my own thoughts. But something had shifted that day. Maybe it was the way the afternoon light had been streaming through our kitchen window, or maybe it was the memory of Mrs. Rodriguez, my cooperating teacher during student teaching, telling me I had a natural gift for connecting with children. Maybe it was simply that I'd reached the limit of how small I could make myself. "I'm taking the job," I'd said, my voice steadier than I felt. David had laughed, actually laughed, and the sound had been sharp enough to cut. "Fine, take your little job. But don't come crying to me when you fail. And don't expect me to pick up the pieces when you realize you're in over your head." That had been the beginning of the end, though neither of us knew it at the time. The teaching position at Riverside Elementary became my sanctuary. For 6 hours a day, I existed in a world where my voice mattered, where my patience was an asset rather than a weakness, where my enthusiasm for learning was infectious rather than embarrassing. I threw myself into lesson planning with the kind of desperate energy that comes from finally finding something that feeds your soul. My first grade students that year were incredible. There was Marcus, who struggled with reading but lit up when we did science experiments. Emma, who was shy but wrote the most beautiful poetry during our creative writing time. Jamal, who had behavioral challenges but responded to clear structure and genuine praise. Each day, I watched these small humans grow and learn, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. But at home, David's campaign of subtle undermining intensified. He'd ask about my day with the kind of false interest that was really just fishing for ammunition. When I'd share a success, a breakthrough with a struggling student, a compliment from my principal, he'd find ways to diminish it. Oh, that's nice that little Emma wrote a poem. Though I suppose at that age, anything with rhyming words probably seems impressive. Or, your principal complimented your bulletin boards? Well, you always were good with arts and crafts. The message was always the same. What I was doing wasn't real work, wasn't important, wasn't something to be genuinely proud of. My accomplishments were diminished, my challenges minimized, my growth ignored. The loneliness of that year was profound. I'd become isolated from most of my friends during our marriage. David had a way of making social plans feel like burdens, and over time, it had become easier to just stay home than to navigate his subtle disapproval. My family lived across the country, and our weekly phone calls were carefully curated performances where I pretended everything was fine. But at school, I wasn't alone. My colleagues began to feel like family. There was Janet, the veteran teacher across the hall who took me under her wing and shared lesson plans with generous abandon. Tom, the second grade teacher who always had a joke ready when the day felt too heavy. Principal Martinez, who saw potential in me and began giving me opportunities to lead professional development sessions. Slowly, quietly, I began to remember who I was beneath the layers of David's expectations and criticisms. I was good at this. No, I was better than good. I was a natural teacher, someone who could see the spark in every child and find ways to help it grow. The voice inside my head that sounded like David began to fade, replaced by the voices of children saying thank you, and colleagues saying, well done, and parents saying, you've made such a difference. But at home, the distance between us grew into a chasm. David seemed to resent my happiness, my newfound confidence. Our conversations became perfunctory exchanges about schedules and logistics. He stopped asking about my work altogether, which was almost worse than his previous dismissiveness. At least dismissal acknowledged that what I did mattered enough to critique. The final straw came on a rainy Thursday in March. I'd had an incredible day. One of my students, a little girl named Lucy who'd been struggling with math concepts all year, had finally had her breakthrough moment during our fractions lesson. The joy on her face when she understood how to compare halves and quarters had been radiant, and I'd felt that familiar surge of pride and purpose that made all the long hours and difficult days worthwhile. I'd come home practically glowing, eager to share the moment with someone who was supposed to care about the things that mattered to me. David was in his home office working on his laptop, and I knocked softly on the doorframe. Hey, do you have a minute? I had the most amazing day and I wanted to tell you about it. He didn't look up from his screen. Can it wait? I'm in the middle of something important. I should have left then. Should have recognized the dismissal for what it was and saved my story for someone who would appreciate it. But I was so full of joy, so proud of Lucy's progress that I pressed on. It's just a quick story. One of my students finally understood fractions today and, Sarah. He finally looked at me and his expression was one of barely contained irritation. I'm working on a proposal that could secure a major contract for my firm. Can your elementary school story please wait until I'm done doing something that actually matters? The words hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. Something that actually matters, as if a child's educational breakthrough was trivial. As if my work, my passion, my purpose was nothing more than a hobby to be tolerated. And in that moment, something inside me cracked wide open. Not broke, cracked. Like an eggshell when the creature inside is finally ready to emerge. You know what, David? My voice was calm, almost conversational. It can wait forever. I turned and walked away, and I never tried to share my work with him again. That night, lying in our bed while David slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and made a decision. I didn't articulate it to myself then, didn't make a formal plan. But somewhere in the depths of my consciousness, I began preparing for a life without him. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process of reclaiming pieces of myself that I'd lost or hidden over the years. I started small buying coffee from the shop near school that David had always dismissed as overpriced. Staying after work to help struggling students without feeling guilty about dinner being late. Accepting invitations to after-work drinks with my colleagues instead of rushing home to prepare David's meal. Each small act of independence felt like a tiny rebellion, and with each rebellion, I grew stronger. I also began to plan more strategically. I opened my own bank account and started direct depositing my paychecks there instead of into our joint account. I researched apartments in the school district where I worked. I quietly consulted with a divorce lawyer to understand my options and rights. David noticed some of the changes, but he seemed to interpret them as phases rather than permanent shifts. When I started coming home later, he complained about the inconvenience to his schedule. When I stopped asking his opinion about my lesson plans or classroom decorations, he seemed relieved rather than concerned. When I began rebuilding connections with old friends, he made snide comments about my social butterfly phase. He never seemed to consider that these weren't phases at all, but the slow, steady emergence of the person I'd always been beneath his expectations. The catalyst came in early May, during the last month of that school year. I'd been nominated for the district's New Teacher Excellence Award, a recognition given to first-year teachers who showed exceptional promise and impact. The ceremony was on a Saturday evening, and winners would be announced in front of colleagues, families, and school board members. I'd been nervous to tell David about the nomination, unsure how he'd react to this level of recognition for work he'd always considered beneath notice. But I'd also been hopeful that maybe finally he'd see that what I did mattered. "That's nice," he'd said when I told him, barely looking up from his newspaper. "When is it?" "Saturday the 15th. The ceremony starts at 6. I think I have something that night." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "You think you have something? David, this is important to me." "I'm sure it is." His tone was placating, the way you might speak to a child who is excited about a school play. "But Sarah, let's be realistic about what this is. It's a participation trophy for new teachers. They probably give these things out like candy." Each word was carefully chosen to deflate my excitement, to make me feel foolish for caring about something he deemed insignificant. And for a moment, I felt the familiar urge to shrink, to apologize for having expectations, to minimize my own achievements. Instead, I asked a simple question. "Will you be there?" The silence stretched between us, and in that silence, I heard my answer. "I'll try," he finally said, which we both knew meant no. That night, I sat in my car in the school parking lot after staying late to finish bulletin boards, and I called my sister Amy for the first time in months. "Sarah!" Her voice was warm, surprised, delighted. "How are you? It's been forever." And for some reason, that simple question, asked with genuine care and interest, broke something open inside me. I started crying right there in my car, ugly sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and long buried. "I'm getting divorced," I said, the words tumbling out before I'd consciously decided to say them. The conversation that followed was 3 hours long and life-changing. Amy listened without judgment as I told her everything. The years of subtle erosion, the constant dismissal, the way I'd lost myself piece by piece. She was furious on my behalf, validating feelings I'd been told were unreasonable. She was also practical, offering to help me research apartments and lawyers and logistics. But most importantly, she reminded me of who I'd been before David. "Sarah, do you remember in college when you tutored that kid from the neighborhood? What was his name, Miguel? His mom couldn't afford regular tutoring, so you worked with him for free every week. By the end of the semester, he'd gone from failing math to getting B's. And you were so proud, so happy. You called me crying because you realized that helping him learn was the best feeling you'd ever had." I did remember. I remembered the joy on Miguel's face when he finally understood long division. I remembered his mother's grateful tears when he brought home his first good report card. I remembered feeling like I'd found my purpose. "That's who you are," Amy continued. "You're someone who sees potential in people and helps them grow. You're someone who makes the world better just by being in it. Don't let anyone make you forget that." After we hung up, I sat in my car for another hour, watching the late afternoon sun slant through the windows of my empty classroom. For the first time in years, I felt completely clear about what I needed to do. The district ceremony was held in the high school auditorium, and despite my expectations, David didn't show up. I sat with my colleague Janet and her husband, trying to focus on the presentations and speeches rather than the empty seat I had optimistically saved. When they called my name as the winner of the New Teacher Excellence Award, I walked to the stage with my head held high. The principal who introduced me talked about my innovative lesson plans, my dedication to struggling students, and the measurable improvement in my class's reading scores. As I accepted the plaque and looked out at the audience of educators and families, I felt a profound sense of belonging. This was my community. These were my people. This work, this calling, this passion that David had dismissed as trivial, it was everything. That night, I went home to an empty house. David had left a note saying he'd gone out with colleagues and would be back late. I sat at our kitchen table, looking at my award, and felt nothing but calm, clear certainty. I spent the weekend apartment hunting and found a small but bright one-bedroom place 10 minutes from school. I put down a deposit and scheduled the move for the last week of school. When I told David I was leaving, he initially didn't take me seriously. "Come on, Sarah, you're being dramatic." So I missed one little ceremony. It's not the end of the world. "It's not about the ceremony," I said calmly. "It's about 5 years of you making me feel like nothing I do matters. It's about you telling me I'll never amount to anything. It's about me finally realizing that I already have." His reaction progressed through the predictable stages: disbelief, anger, bargaining, more anger. He accused me of being ungrateful, of throwing away our marriage over career nonsense, of being selfish and unrealistic. He reminded me of all the ways he'd supported me, conveniently forgetting the constant undermining and dismissal. But his words bounced off me like rain off a window. I'd found my center, my sense of self-worth, and it was unshakable. I moved out on a sunny Saturday in June with help from Amy, who flew in for the occasion, and several colleagues who had become true friends. David wasn't there. He'd gone to his parents' house, claiming he couldn't bear to watch me make such a huge mistake. That evening, as I sat in my new apartment surrounded by boxes and possibilities, I legally changed my name back to Sarah Chen, reclaiming the identity I'd set aside when I became Mrs. Mitchell. The next 2 years were a period of incredible growth and discovery. I threw myself into my career with renewed passion, pursuing professional development opportunities and gradually building a reputation as an innovative, dedicated educator. I moved from substitute positions to a permanent role and then to a coveted position at one of the district's most sought-after schools. My personal life blossomed as well. I reconnected with old friends and made new ones. I traveled during summer breaks, something David had always found reasons to avoid. I took up hobbies I'd abandoned, rediscovered interests I'd forgotten I had. I also eventually began dating again. Nothing serious at first, just casual dinners and movies that reminded me what it felt like to be with someone who was genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions. But slowly, carefully, I opened my heart to the possibility of love again. Real love. The kind built on mutual respect and genuine partnership. Throughout this period, David made sporadic attempts to contact me. Calls and texts that started angry, then became pleading, then shifted to attempts at manipulation. He'd heard I was doing well, he said. He missed me. He'd made mistakes. Couldn't we try again? I responded to none of these overtures. I'd learned to recognize his patterns, and I knew that his regret wasn't about losing me as a person. It was about losing his control over me. His convenient emotional punching bag, his source of ego validation. Besides, I was happy. Genuinely, deeply, authentically happy in a way I'd never been during our marriage. Why would I trade that for a return to diminishment and dismissal? Which brings me to this moment. Thursday afternoon, 3:15 p.m., sitting in my third grade classroom at Willowbrook Elementary, waiting for the parent conference that will bring David Mitchell face to face with the woman he once told would never amount to anything. Sophia Mitchell had been in my class since September, and from the very first day, she'd been a standout student. Not because she was the smartest or the most advanced, though she was certainly bright, but because of her kindness, her curiosity, her gentle way of helping struggling classmates without being asked. She reminded me of myself at that age, eager to please, hungry to learn, sensitive to the emotions of adults around her. It had taken me several weeks to make the connection. Mitchell is a common enough surname, and I'd had no reason to suspect a link to my ex-husband. It wasn't until I was updating emergency contact information and saw David's name and signature that the pieces clicked into place. My first instinct had been panic. Should I request that Sophia be transferred to another classroom? Was it ethical for me to teach the daughter of someone I had such complicated history with? Would my feelings about David affect my ability to be fair to his child? But as I'd watched Sophia over the following weeks, all of those concerns had faded. This little girl was not responsible for her father's failings. She deserved the best education I could provide, regardless of my personal history. And honestly, she was such a joy to teach that it would have been my loss to give her up. Still, I'd been curious about David's life since our divorce. Sophia lived primarily with her mother, Rachel, whom she talked about frequently and adoringly. David was mentioned much less often, and when he was, it was usually in the context of weekend visits or missed school events. My dad was supposed to come to the book fair, Sophia had mentioned one day, but he had to work again. Or my dad said he'd help me with my science project, but then he forgot. The pattern was depressingly familiar. What wasn't familiar was seeing Sophia's absolute delight in learning, her confidence in expressing her ideas, her natural leadership abilities. Whatever David's shortcomings as a parent, this child was thriving. She was curious and kind, creative and confident, everything I'd always hoped a student of mine could be. Over the months, Sophia and I had developed a special connection. She often stayed after class to help organize books or feed the class fish. She brought me drawings and stories, always eager to share her latest creation. During our reading groups, she asked thoughtful questions that showed she was thinking deeply about the stories we explored together. And then, 3 weeks ago, something had happened that crystallized everything for me. We'd been having a particularly challenging day. One of those days where everything goes wrong and everyone's emotions are running high. 2 students had gotten into an argument during recess. The classroom computer had crashed during an important lesson, and I'd been feeling frazzled and overwhelmed. I was trying to reset the classroom atmosphere after lunch when Sophia approached my desk quietly. "Mrs. Chen," she said softly, "are you okay? You seem sad." The simple kindness of the question, the genuine concern in her 8-year-old eyes, had nearly brought me to tears. "I'm just having a tough day, sweetheart, but thank you for asking." She'd nodded solemnly, then returned to her seat. 20 minutes later, during our independent reading time, she'd brought me a folded piece of paper. Inside was a drawing of me standing in front of our classroom, smiling, with words written in her careful 3rd-grade handwriting. "Mrs. Chen is the best teacher ever. She makes learning fun and always helps us when we need it. Thank you for being so nice to us." At the bottom, she'd drawn a rainbow with the words, "Hope your day gets better." I'd kept that drawing, and it was now pinned to the bulletin board behind my desk. A daily reminder of why I loved this job, why this work mattered, why I'd been right to fight for this life. Now, looking at Sophia's conference folder, I felt nothing but pride and anticipation. This child was thriving under my guidance. Her test scores were excellent, her creative writing was developing beautifully, and her social skills were exemplary. I had nothing but positive things to share about her progress. The irony was not lost on me. The man who had told me I'd never amount to anything was about to hear detailed evidence of exactly how much I'd amounted to, delivered through a discussion of his own daughter's success in my classroom. A soft knock on my door interrupted my thoughts. Through the window, I could see a familiar figure, though he looked older, more tired than I remembered. David stood in the hallway checking his phone, wearing the same impatient expression he'd always worn when forced to deal with things he considered beneath his notice. I took a deep breath, smoothed my professional blazer, and opened the door. "Mr. Mitchell, please come in. I'm Mrs. Chen, Sophia's teacher." For just a moment, his eyes widened in recognition. I watched him process the sight of me, professional, confident, clearly in my element, and saw the cascade of emotions cross his face. Surprise, confusion, and something that might have been embarrassment. Sarah. My name came out as barely a whisper. Mrs. Chen, I corrected gently, gesturing toward the small table where I held all my parent conferences. Please have a seat. I'm so excited to talk with you about Sophia's progress this year. David sat down slowly, his eyes taking in my classroom, the colorful bulletin boards displaying student work, the reading nook with its cozy beanbags and overflowing bookshelves, the science center where we conducted our weekly experiments. I could see him trying to reconcile this vibrant, organized, obviously thriving learning environment with his long held beliefs about my capabilities. I had no idea, he said finally, his voice hoarse. When the school called to schedule this conference, they just said Mrs. Chen. I never imagined that it would be me. I settled into my chair with the ease of someone completely comfortable in her professional skin. I imagine it is a surprise, but I'm sure you're here to discuss Sophia, not catch up on old times. The gentle redirect seemed to snap him back to the present moment. He straightened in his chair, trying to reassemble the confident demeanor I remembered from our marriage. Right, yes. Sophia's? How is she doing? I opened her portfolio with genuine enthusiasm. She's doing wonderfully, Mr. Mitchell. Sophia is truly one of the most delightful students I've ever had the pleasure of teaching. For the next 20 minutes, I walked him through his daughter's academic progress with the same thoroughness and professionalism I brought to every parent conference. I showed him her writing samples, which had progressed from simple sentences in September to complex, imaginative stories by December. I explained her math scores, which placed her in the advanced group. I detailed her reading level, which was nearly 2 grade levels above her peers. But more than academics, I talked about the kind of child Sophia was. Her kindness to classmates who struggled, her creativity during art projects, her thoughtful questions during our science experiments, her natural leadership skills during group work. She has an exceptional emotional intelligence, I explained, pulling out examples of her work. Look at this story she wrote about a new student feeling left out. She not only identified the problem, but created a solution where the other children found ways to include him. That level of empathy and problem solving is remarkable for an 8-year-old. As I spoke, I watched David's expression change. The defensive posture he'd maintained at the beginning of our meeting gradually relaxed. His eyes, which had initially avoided mine, began to focus on the work I was showing him. And slowly, I saw something I'd rarely witnessed during our marriage: genuine pride and amazement. I had no idea she was doing so well, he said quietly, studying a math worksheet where Sophia had not only solved complex problems, but had drawn pictures to explain her thinking. At home, we don't really. He trailed off, but I could fill in the blanks. At home, homework was probably rushed through so she could return to whatever adult activity was taking priority. Her academic achievements likely went unnoticed among the chaos of David's work schedule and social obligations. She talks about you often, I said, which was a generous interpretation of her occasional weekend stories. She's proud to be your daughter. Something in his face crumpled at that, and for a moment, I saw past the arrogant exterior to something vulnerable underneath. I've been working so much lately, he said, almost to himself. The divorce was complicated, financial pressures. I know I haven't been as present as I should be. There it was, the first crack in the facade, the beginning of what I suspected would be a cascade of revelations and regrets. Sophia is resilient, I said carefully. Children are remarkably adaptable, but she does best with consistency and encouragement. She's hungry for approval, eager to please. When adults take interest in her work and celebrate her achievements, she absolutely blooms. The subtext was clear, though I never explicitly stated it. Your daughter needs you to notice her, to value her, to show up for her. The same things every child needs. The same things I'd once needed from him. David was quiet for a long moment, studying the portfolio of his daughter's work. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. Sarah, Mrs. Chen, I can't believe, this is incredible. You've done so much for her. I had no idea she was capable of this level of work. Oh, she's always been capable, I said gently. I've just provided the environment for her capabilities to shine. That's what good teaching is. Seeing the potential that's already there and nurturing it. Another pause. Another moment where I could see him processing not just information about his daughter, but the implications of my success, my obvious competence, my professional fulfillment. You seem you seem really happy here, he said finally. I am. The response was simple, honest, without elaboration or qualification. This is exactly where I belong. As our conference wound down, I provided him with suggestions for supporting Sophia's learning at home, recommended books that would challenge her reading level, and outlined areas where she might benefit from additional enrichment. I spoke with the authority of someone who knew his daughter well, who had invested time and care in understanding her unique strengths and needs. Mrs. Chen, he said, as he gathered up the folders and handouts I'd provided, thank you, not just for this conference, but for everything you've done for Sophia. It's clear that she's lucky to have you as her teacher. I'm lucky to have her as my student, I replied, walking him toward the door. She's a remarkable little girl. You should be very proud. At the door, he turned back, and I could see he was struggling with something he wanted to say. Sarah, I... He stopped, swallowed, tried again. I was wrong about you, about what you were capable of. I can see that now. The admission hung in the air between us. 3 years ago, it would have meant everything to me. 3 years ago, I would have cried with relief to hear him acknowledge my worth, my capabilities, my value. Now it felt like a statement of the obvious. Of course he'd been wrong. I'd known that for years. Thank you, I said simply. I appreciate you saying that. Do you think... He hesitated, then pushed forward. Do you think we could maybe talk sometime? I mean, about us? About what happened? And there it was, the predictable request. The inevitable attempt to rewrite history now that he'd been forced to confront the reality of my success. Now that he could see what he'd lost, what he'd dismissed, what he'd thrown away. I looked at this man I'd once loved, once tried desperately to please, once allowed to define my worth. I felt nothing but a kind of distant compassion for someone who was clearly struggling with the consequences of his own choices. David, I said gently, I think we just did talk. About Sophia, about her education, about how she's thriving. That's really all we need to discuss. The rejection was soft, but unmistakable. I wasn't angry, wasn't bitter, wasn't interested in rehashing old grievances or exploring possibilities for reconciliation. I had simply moved on, moved forward, moved into a life where his opinion of me was irrelevant. He nodded slowly, understanding the finality in my tone. Right, of course. Well, thank you again for everything. After he left, I sat alone in my classroom for a few minutes, processing the encounter. On my bulletin board, Sophia's drawing smiled down at me, the one where she'd called me the best teacher ever, where she'd drawn a rainbow to brighten my difficult day, and tomorrow Sophia would bound into my classroom with her usual enthusiasm, eager to share whatever adventure she'd had the night before. She'd raise her hand during our science lesson, participate thoughtfully in our reading discussions, and help a struggling classmate without being asked. She'd remind me why I loved this work, why this calling mattered, why I'd been right to fight for this life. And maybe, if I was lucky, she'd stay after class to help feed the fish or organize books, giving me another opportunity to nurture the remarkable potential I saw in her every day. 3 months later, I was sitting in the faculty lounge during lunch when Janet plopped down beside me with her usual dramatic flair. Sarah, you'll never guess what I just heard in the office. I looked up from the stack of creative writing assignments I was grading, recognizing Janet's gossip tone. After 3 years of friendship, I knew she had a weakness for school district drama. What's that? Sophia Mitchell's father called the main office this morning. Apparently, he wants to know if there's any way to guarantee that Sophia gets you as her teacher again next year when she moves to 4th grade. I set down my red pen, surprised. Really? Really? Mrs. Patterson said he went on and on about how much Sophia loves your class, how much she's learned, how you're the best teacher she's ever had. He even asked if there were any enrichment programs or summer camps you'd be involved with. The irony was so complete, it was almost poetic. The man who had once told me I'd never amount to anything was now actively seeking ways to keep his daughter under my educational influence. That's unexpected, I said finally. There's more, Janet continued, clearly enjoying herself. Apparently, word is getting around the parent network about what an amazing teacher you are. Mrs. Patterson said they've had 3 other families specifically request you for next year. I felt a familiar glow of professional pride. This was how careers were built, how reputations developed, through the quiet accumulation of successful students, satisfied parents, and word of mouth recommendations. And, Janet added with a grin, I heard through the grapevine that you're being considered for the master teacher recognition next year. You know, the one that comes with the salary bump and the leadership opportunities? Master Teacher Recognition, the highest honor the district bestowed on classroom educators, reserved for those who demonstrated exceptional skill, innovation, and impact. It was something I'd dreamed about but hadn't dared to hope for so early in my career. Where did you hear that?
Hey.
Principal Martinez may have mentioned it when she was discussing next year's staffing plans. Janet waggled her eyebrows. Sarah, do you realize what this means? You've been teaching for what, 4 years? And you're already being considered for master teacher status? That's practically unheard of. As we talked, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 4 years ago, I'd been a woman who doubted her own capabilities, who had internalized someone else's limiting beliefs about her potential. I'd been married to a man who saw my dreams as inconveniences and my aspirations as delusions. Now I was not only a successful teacher, but someone whose expertise was being recognized and sought out. Parents requested me specifically, colleagues sought my advice. Administrators saw leadership potential in me. I'd found my calling and excelled at it, despite every prediction to the contrary. But more than professional success, I'd found something even more valuable. I'd found myself, the confident, capable, passionate person I'd always been underneath the layers of doubt and diminishment. I'd reclaimed my voice, my dreams, my sense of worth. That afternoon, as my students worked on their science journals, Sophia approached my desk with a familiar, shy smile. Mrs. Chen, I wanted to ask you something. Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind? My dad said that next year I'll have a different teacher because I'll be in 4th grade. But he also said, maybe there was a way I could still be in your class somehow. I knelt down so we were at eye level. Well, I teach 3rd grade, so you'll definitely need to move on to 4th grade with Mrs. Wilson. But that doesn't mean we can't still be friends. I'll always be interested in hearing about how you're doing. Her face fell slightly. I just really like being in your class. You make everything so interesting. And you always listen to our ideas. That's very sweet of you to say. But you know what? Mrs. Wilson is an excellent teacher too. And part of growing up is experiencing new things, meeting new people, taking on new challenges. You're going to do amazing things in 4th grade. Do you really think so? I know so. You're smart, kind, creative, and hardworking. Those qualities will serve you well no matter which classroom you're in. She beamed at the compliment, then skipped back to her seat to continue her work. Watching her go, I felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came from nurturing a young mind, from building confidence and fostering growth. This was why I did what I did. Not for recognition or revenge or vindication, but for moments like these, moments where I could help a child see her own potential and believe in her ability to achieve it. The fact that this particular child happened to be the daughter of a man who had once told me I'd never amount to anything was simply a beautiful coincidence, a perfect illustration of how wrong he'd been about everything that truly mattered. 6 months later, I was cleaning out my desk on the last day of the school year when I found Sophia's rainbow drawing again, tucked between some old lesson plans. I smiled as I remembered that difficult day when her simple kindness had reminded me why I loved teaching. The year had been extraordinary. My students had exceeded all academic expectations, several had qualified for the gifted and talented program, and parent satisfaction scores were the highest in the building. I'd been officially selected for master teacher recognition and would begin leadership training over the summer. But more than professional achievements, I'd watched 22 young humans grow and flourish under my guidance. I'd seen shy children find their voices, struggling students discover their strengths, and confident learners push themselves to new heights. As I packed up my personal items, Janet knocked on my doorframe. Ready for summer vacation? Almost, just gathering everything up. Big plans? I smiled, thinking about the trip to Europe I had planned, something I'd always wanted to do but had never felt free to pursue during my marriage. A few adventures. You. Family time mostly, but Sarah, before you leave, I wanted to tell you something. I looked up, hearing an unusual seriousness in her tone. I've been teaching for 15 years, she continued, and I've watched a lot of new teachers come and go. Some are good, some are okay, and a few are truly exceptional. You're in that last category. What you've accomplished in just 4 years is remarkable, and I wanted you to know that. The compliment meant more to me than any formal recognition could have. Janet was a veteran educator whose opinion I respected deeply, and hearing her acknowledge my growth felt like a validation of everything I'd worked for. Thank you, I said, genuinely moved. That means a lot, especially coming from you. I also wanted to say that watching your transformation over these years has been inspiring. When you first came here, you were good at what you did, but you seemed, I don't know, like you were holding back somehow, like you didn't quite believe in yourself. Now you teach with such confidence, such joy. It's been amazing to witness. She was right. 4 years ago, I'd been tentative, constantly second-guessing myself, looking for external validation to confirm what I was slowly learning about my own abilities. Now I trusted my instincts, advocated for my students with confidence, and approached each new challenge with curiosity rather than fear. I had some things to work through, I said simply. Well, whatever you worked through, it suited you. I hope you have a wonderful summer, Sarah. You've earned it. After she left, I finished packing and took one last look around my classroom. Tomorrow, the maintenance crew would come in to deep clean and prepare for next year. In a few weeks, I'd return to set up again, to create a new learning environment for a new group of students. But for now, I was content to appreciate how far I'd come. 4 years ago, I'd been a woman who believed she might never amount to anything. Today, I was someone whose work mattered, whose expertise was valued, whose impact was measurable and meaningful. I'd built a life that was entirely my own, professionally fulfilling, personally satisfying, emotionally authentic. I'd surrounded myself with people who appreciated and supported me. I'd found work that fed my soul and challenged me to grow. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my own voice, to value my own dreams, to believe in my own worth, regardless of what anyone else thought or said. 2 weeks into my European vacation, as I sat in a cafe in Florence watching the world go by, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When I opened it, I saw a photo of a little girl holding up what appeared to be a certificate, beaming with pride. The message below read, "Sophia made the honor roll in summer school. She said to tell her favorite teacher, 'Thank you for everything you did for her this year. David.'" I stared at the photo for a long moment, taking in Sophia's delighted expression and obvious pride in her achievement. She looked confident, happy, successful. Everything I'd hoped for her when she'd been in my classroom. I typed back a brief response. "Congratulations to Sophia. I'm so proud of her. She's a remarkable young lady." The reply came quickly. "She is. And I'm finally realizing that's partly because she had a remarkable teacher." I set my phone aside and returned to my coffee and my guidebook. Tomorrow, I was planning to visit the Uffizi Gallery, something I'd dreamed of doing since college but had never felt free to pursue. After that, a cooking class. Then a day trip to the Tuscan countryside. It was a life I'd built myself, funded by my own hard work, shaped by my own choices and dreams. A life where I was valued, respected, and appreciated for exactly who I was. The woman who had once been told she'd never amount to anything was now living a life of purpose, impact, and fulfillment that exceeded her wildest dreams. And the man who had delivered that devastating verdict was now actively seeking her professional expertise for his daughter's education, recognizing, perhaps too late, the extraordinary person he'd failed to see when it might have mattered. The irony was perfect, but it was no longer the point. I'd moved beyond needing his recognition or regret. I'd built something beautiful and meaningful from the ashes of his dismissal, and that achievement belonged entirely to me. Sitting in that cafe in Florence, planning my next adventure, I smiled and opened my guidebook to plan the next chapter of a life that was entirely, authentically, triumphantly my own. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply living well, succeeding spectacularly, and finding joy in proving that someone else's limitations were never your own.